You know, I try my hardest to find images of those I discuss in my videos, obviously. And despite years of searching, I've never been able to find a photograph of a little girl named Barbara Holzman. That's what I initially wrote. And then, as I was recording these voiceovers, someone posted a picture of her, taken from an old newspaper, and posted it to her findagrave.com profile. The timing could not have been more perfect than that. I always wondered what she looked like, and now I have an idea. Barbara was born on March 13, 1906, to Valentine and Anne-Marie Holzman while they lived in Russia. By 1911, the Holzmans had emigrated to America, settling in what would today be called North Portland, at a modest but new home on Borthwick Street. This brings us to March 13, 1911, Barbara Holzman's 5th birthday. I don't know what the plans were to celebrate this milestone, if there were any at all. But as it would erroneously be reported, Barbara was playing out in front of her house when she up and vanished. Upon noticing she was gone, there was a panic that she had been grabbed off the street right there. However, the actual story is that she had been sent to a local meat market by her family. What would be considered a no-way-in-hell errand for a 5-year-old child today was actually a very common thing back then. What should have been a short trip turned into an hour, and then another hour. And suddenly the Holzmans realized something was wrong and reported their daughter as missing. The search was on, but Barbara was nowhere to be found. As the world went to bed for the night, there were no signs as to what happened to little Barbara. In a small rooming house on the northwest corner of Mississippi Avenue and Russell Street, in the middle of the downtown Albina area, landlady Bertha Nelson was making her rounds, checking on rooms and cleaning out rooms of recently departed tenants. When she reached room number 10, it was closed up and quiet. She assumed the middle-aged man who'd checked it out the morning before must have left, even though his room key was nowhere to be found. Nelson entered the empty room and began tidying up. After sweeping, she went to make the bed. She pulled back the covers and saw 2 piercing dark eyes staring up at her. It was the body of a little girl. She was practically nude and had been ravaged by an attacker. A bloody froth had formed around her nostrils, suggesting she'd been choked to death. Some papers reported that the bedding she'd been wrapped in was soaked in her blood. She was later identified as 5-year-old Barbara Holzman. A coroner's jury held later would reach the conclusion that Barbara died as a result of shock and suffocation, and she likely suffered much more before that. Walking up Albina Avenue here. Been to this area many times, and oftentimes to cover some murder case or another. The historic Albina area, which is a little stretch of Russell right up here. Lots of murder cases have happened on this little 3-block stretch, and I've discussed a lot of them in depth. I did a Historic Murders of Portland episode on this very case, but I definitely felt the story deserved more. So here's the historic stretch. I know this is Davis Block. Behind here was a dance hall where a woman's bones were discovered. I did a video called Bones Under the Dance Hall on my channel. And yeah, there's a few buildings up there. And yeah, this is just one of the remaining areas of lots of older architecture from back when Albina was its own town. And this building over here is fairly old. There's the White Eagle Saloon dead ahead. Lots of historic architecture. And despite the fact that there's still a lot of old buildings here, a few buildings that were here a while back are now gone. There used to be what appeared to be a fairly large apartment house in this lot. And directly across Mississippi Avenue here, at Russell in Mississippi, was a smaller rooming house. And this is where Barbara Holzman was found, in the room that was checked out by the man that lured her there. Today it is a parking lot. You'd never guess by looking at it that anything so dark and tragic happened in such a place. So obviously there's a lot here that wasn't here back in 1911. This building probably was, but yeah, so the roads are a little bit altered. A lot of roads that went through here don't anymore because, well, there's multiple on-ramps to a freeway here. So I'm not exactly sure what way Barbara Holzman would have come down, but I know that she lived on Borthwick, which is just a couple blocks this way. So she may have come straight down Borthwick to Russell and then over to the spot right past these apartment houses here, and that's where she ended up.
She was just there. Initially it was implied that she was just taken off the street in front of her house. Early reports did say that she'd just been playing out front, and then all of a sudden her parents noticed she was gone. However, later on, the more consistent story became that she had been sent to pick up some meat at the local market for her family. I don't know where that market was. I assume it was between here and there, and somewhere along the way this guy encountered her and lured her away, or I guess you could say whisked her away. And it was her birthday. I didn't realize that the first time I covered this story. It was her birthday when this happened. Murdered on her 5th birthday.
And this is Fremont, which has always kind of been bustling. So maybe the meat market was on Fremont. I feel like this is the closest busy street to where Barbara Holzman lived, and where she was killed is just, I don't know, 5 blocks that way. So this could have been the area where this meat market was supposed to be. I don't know, because they never gave a specific address to that story, even though old newspapers were great at doing that. But right up here where Fremont wraps around is where Borthwick is. Now, I guess it does go through here, but obviously where the freeway is, it doesn't. This is Fremont and Borthwick. And yeah, it was right down this stretch
between Fremont and Beach. This is the street that Barbara Holzman lived on. Her address would translate to 3601. So I think it's just a couple houses up from here. So with her house just right around the corner here, this is the little street I guess she would have been quote-unquote playing on. Like initially it was thought she was playing in the street right here and someone grabbed her. But instead it appears she was just walking off this way towards the market. I can only assume when she left her home that she would have gone this way. Now she could have gone the opposite way. The market could have been north of here, and just the guy she encountered had to lure her a long ways. It's 1911, so I don't really, a lot of people still didn't have cars, and the guy that checked out the room that Barbara was found in was thought to look kind of like a little bit of a worn-out middle-aged transient, was kind of how he was described. So my guess is wherever he found her, he lured her there on foot. But I can only assume this would have been the way she was walking when she first started making her way to the store.
Authorities quickly tried to piece together what happened, and it began with the only witness who saw the man who checked out the room where Barbara was found, Bertha Nelson. As she would tell it, around 10:30 a.m. on March 13th, only a couple hours before Barbara went missing, a tall and slender man, about 45 to 50 years of age, checked out room number 10 at her house. He stood about 6 feet tall and weighed about 160 pounds. His face was mostly clean-shaven, exposing sunken cheekbones, aside from a black mustache with a few gray hairs in it. He was of a dark complexion, which meant something different than it does today, and stoop-shouldered with dark eyes. While he dressed somewhat nice, including a long dark overcoat and a black hat, he had a rough look to him, indicating to Nelson that he was likely a laborer of some kind. Shortly after the man checked in, he left the rooming house for several hours, returning around 1 p.m. Shortly after his return, Nelson heard what sounded like a bundle of something being dropped on the floor in the vicinity of his room. She paid this little mind and heard no further sounds from room number 10, aside from some brief pacing shortly after the, quote, bundle drop. Nelson said she paid closer attention to him than other tenants as he acted somewhat strangely. She even considered the possibility that he was suicidal. During this time, it was, tragically, very common to find people dead by their own hand in the run-down hotels and rooming houses of Portland, and probably many other cities. And shortly after checking in, as he walked toward his room, this man paused and uttered, "I reckon I'll leave my overcoat on in the room." Why he felt the need to say this is anyone's guess, and it might mean nothing. But that doesn't make it any less strange. By the time Barbara was discovered in that room, this man was long gone, and may have been for several hours. He never gave a name when he checked in, and thus, such an easy method of identification was not possible. With what little they had to work with, investigators assumed if he had been a laborer with a laborious look to him, that this man may have been working odd jobs in the area. The Holzmans lived only about 10 blocks to the northeast of the rooming house in question, which made law enforcement wonder if the man had seen Barbara before. And after noticing her, he waited for the opportunity to grab her. A more likely scenario is that this man happened upon Barbara as she was walking to the market and just seized the opportunity. Depending on where they encountered each other, one could argue he simply grabbed her off the street or, more likely, lured her at least to the vicinity of that Albina rooming house. Regardless of how Barbara's abduction happened, the most important thing for investigators was to find the man responsible before it was too late. What followed over the next several months to several years was a seemingly endless string of possible suspects and people of interest, shining a light on a previously ignored or unknown underbelly of Portland, dripping with creeps and sex fiends. Half a dozen individuals were brought in within the first 48 hours, all of whom had been caught in the act or at least accused of pursuing children. A W.J. Robertson reported a man he'd known to be accused of a similar crime to the Holzman case, but when looked into, it was found this man was in California when the murder happened. A man in Spokane, Washington, busted previously on a similar charge, was briefly looked into, but he'd been busted on another charge and was in jail when the murder occurred. Another woman contacted the police to let them know that a man who'd recently been killed by an oncoming train was the one responsible for the murder. It was learned that a few days before Barbara was killed, a man, who was reportedly never captured, went to a grocery store on Union and Fremont, just a few blocks east of where the Holzmans lived. While there, he tried to attack a 15-year-old girl who worked there before others nearby scared him off. In a March 17th newspaper article, it was reported that a man who had served time for attacking an 11-year-old girl had recently been living near the intersection of Russell and Mississippi. Police were searching for him, but a name was never given, nor was it reported whether he was found or not. Another unidentified man was seen harassing girls in the Goose Hollow neighborhood, admittedly a good distance from Albina. A motorman, Peak Phillips, reported to the police about a man he saw making advancements towards little girls who'd been jumped and beaten by several men. Phillips said the man had been turned over to police, but was only charged with vagrancy. Even when Barbara's funeral was being held on the afternoon of March 16th, a man was chased from the vicinity of Commercial and Morris, where Emmanuel Hospital now stands, and only about 8 blocks from where the Holzmans lived. This man had been bothering some local girls. He was chased to Mississippi before his pursuers lost him. This man was reportedly known to frequent the Tivoli Saloon on Graham Street near Mississippi, just 2 blocks from where the rooming house was where Barbara was killed. This man also bore an appearance similar to the man who checked into Bertha Nelson's house. The following day, March 17th, a man giving the name of T.F. Bain arrived in the town of Marshfield, later renamed Coos Bay, on a steamer begging for food, claiming he hadn't eaten in over a day. He also, reportedly, looked like the man at the rooming house. He then, reportedly, went to nearby Bandon, where he went to a barber shop and had his mustache shaved off. One of the killer's most distinct features was his mustache. It was then said that he caught another steamer headed for San Francisco, but he would later be found in Roseburg, Oregon. Upon being found, he was quick to provide an alibi for his whereabouts when Barbara Holzman was murdered. Despite all of these sightings, none of them came close to yielding a solid suspect, but it did fill locals with a sense of shock and disgust. And then, the first solid break. Another potential dead lead, George Brown, captured police's attention for how closely he matched Bertha Nelson's description of the man. They began staking Brown out, who spent most of his time working as a hand on a local farm during the day and drinking at saloons at night. When he was finally arrested, he told police he arrived in Portland on March 9th, where he stayed at a lodging house until the 13th, when he left for Salem for a few days, before returning to Portland on the 15th. It's certainly of interest that he made certain to say that he left on the day that Barbara was killed, perhaps trying to push an alibi. However, before his arrival on the 9th, he had been working on the farm of a Mrs. E.M. Flauner. And when he was asked when he first heard about the Holzman murder, he said he spoke of it with Mrs. Flauner. But the murder didn't happen until 4 days after he left Flauner's farm. And if that wasn't somewhat suspicious, an acquaintance of Brown's, a P.C. Buger, came forward and said that while he was looking for a location to open a new tavern, that Brown suggested a space under a rooming house at 107 Russell Street, the very rooming house where Barbara was killed. Brown denied this, but Buger presented his records, which showed a notation of this address and attributing it to George Brown. The next step, as would be the case many times, was bringing Brown to Bertha Nelson for an identification. She took a look at him and quickly said he was not the man who checked out the room, despite claims that he matched her description so closely. As would also become standard in this case, without a definite identification from Nelson, Brown was released. This method of investigation, which admittedly authorities had little else to go on than what Nelson's eyes saw, may or may not have let a guilty party go free. As much as we want, and sometimes need, to rely on eyewitness testimony, it is still imperfect. Oftentimes, when we see someone we did not know previously, and for only a brief moment, our memory of their appearance often fades shortly after. Sure, we can recall certain details, such as sex, whether someone was very tall or very short, hair length, etc. But still in all, it's hardly the same as having a video or a photograph of someone that cannot be wrong. And with the passage of time, our memories of such things as that one person's appearance become even more unreliable, as it is still the product of our imperfect memories, and often is the result of a constant reminder of those imperfections. What I'm getting at is, the greatest problem in this case is that it relied exclusively on Bertha Nelson's memory. And how reliable was that? Do we even really know? Was George Brown guilty despite her dismissal? If he was there, it was only weak evidence, not directly related to the crime against him. But once he was gone, the case went cold, with no real suspect over the next couple months. And then, June 9th, 1911, shortly after midnight, William and Ruth Hill, and 2 children from Ruth's previous marriage, Philip and Dorothy Rintoul, were all savagely beaten to death by an axe-wielding killer in their home just south of Portland, a case I've mentioned several times. The case would never be solved, but it had its own share of suspects. Only a week after Barbara's murder, a letter was sent to local police, presumably written by her killer, that said they'd soon commit a more serious crime. Authorities wondered if this was in reference to the Hill murders that were to come. Aside from this letter, though, there did not seem to be much of a connection between the 2 crimes, until the murder of Dorothy Rintoul was considered. While Barbara Holzman was killed on her 5th birthday, Dorothy was killed only 4 days after her 6th birthday. This likely means nothing, but it's just a coincidence that I thought I'd mention. And while investigating the crime scene, authorities saw signs that, while an effort may have been made to assault Ruth Hill, only one member of the Hill family happened to be assaulted during this massacre, and that was the youngest child, Dorothy. Thus, both of these girls had been assaulted around the time of their death. Once again, law enforcement was out in force, looking for a depraved killer. Just over a month later, July 14th, in the small town of Rainier, Washington, a young couple, Archie and Nettie Cobble, were brutally beaten to death with an axe. Nettie's body had also been assaulted. The case quickly became tied with the Hill murders, with one of the first suspects being a man named Swan Peterson, a man in his 60s. He'd passed through Rainier at the time of the murders, and blood was found in his hotel room. He would later be dismissed as a suspect when the blood there was attributed to a little girl who'd been playing with a knife there earlier. While he was dismissed in this crime, though, some still felt Peterson may have been responsible, and he just happened to be a middle-aged laborer who'd passed through Portland multiple times. He was at least passively mentioned as a possible suspect in the Holzman crime, but never seriously considered. A possibly mentally ill man named George Wilson would ultimately be convicted for the Cobble murders based on very shaky evidence, including a confession he gave that he later felt was based on a delusion. And 2 months later, in early September, just north of Portland, Daisy Wehrman and her little son Harold were gunned down in their home, another case where someone was convicted with many feeling he wasn't responsible. But we'll be getting back to that story later. With these later mysterious murders happening, in particular the Hill murders, the tragic death of Barbara Holzman quickly became buried. While the Hill killings still get talked about, very few mention or even know about Barbara's killing. By mid-December 1911, perhaps the most scrutinized suspect in this whole case would be taken into custody on the matter. His name was Leon Lockard. He was already serving a sentence at the Kelly Butte jail for robbery, but he came to attention of authorities due to a few individuals who knew him. First of all was a man named Frank Jennings, Lockard's former boss, who told authorities that he heard Lockard speaking to others and taking credit for the Holzman murder. Jennings also had a bone to pick with Lockard, whom he claimed was trying to get him mixed up in a robbery escapade of his. So was he telling the truth, or was he just trying to throw Lockard under the bus? Jennings would also say that Lockard frequently hung out in the vicinity of Russell and Mississippi. And Lockard indirectly confirmed this by admitting to being in Portland when Barbara was killed, along with the fact that he frequented the Babcock Barber Shop on the ground floor of the rooming house where Barbara was killed. Of further suspicion, he said he went to this barber shop to buy mustache dye. The man who checked out the room, despite having graying hair, had mostly a dark mustache. Could the killer have been dyeing his mustache hair? It was learned that a mystery man had visited that barber shop on the day Barbara was killed, asking for a shave and a bath, to which the proprietor recommended another place. Police wondered if Lockard was this man, putting him right there on that day. But when the proprietor was shown a picture of him, he did recognize him as a customer, but not as this mystery man. Algie McBride was another witness who claimed Lockard took credit for the murder, and that he admitted to him one night that his greatest criminal regret was killing that little girl in Albina. Another witness, J.W. Logan, claimed that he saw Lockard exit that rooming house on the day of the murder. He was definitely looking like the strongest suspect. He had come to Portland after a release from prison in 1908, wherein he settled in the Albina area as he looked for work. He was a lifelong transient laborer. He also had a record of assault against women, including multiple instances of, quote, insulting women, a common crime amidst creeps back in those days. Shortly before Lockard's recent arrest for robbery, he was living with an older ex-con named J.F. Hawks. Hawks would claim one night that he found Lockard crying in the basement, lamenting on a crime he said he was sorry for. It was time to take him to see Bertha Nelson. After being taken to the barbershop and rooming house, at which time Lockard showed no signs of nervousness or discomfort, he was shown to Nelson, who expressed she was pretty sure that he was the man. In what would become a reoccurring statement of hers, showing her own acknowledgement that memories are not picture perfect, she felt strongly that Lockard was the man, but wouldn't say for sure because if she was wrong, she too could end up being a murderer. This was because whoever was convicted of killing Barbara Holzman no doubt would have been executed for their crime. By December 19th, the attitude was still strong that Leon Lockard was likely Barbara's killer. That very day, an individual that I have spoken about many times would be arrested for a different crime. Nathan Harvey, my strongest suspect for the Hill murders and the murder of Mamie Walsh in 1892, would be arrested in relation to the Hill murders. And with his arrest, a background steeped in strange behavior, numerous strange deaths in his family, and, most importantly, a history of pedophilic behavior rose to the surface. And if he were guilty for 14-year-old Mamie Walsh's assault and murder, and 6-year-old Dorothy Rintoul's assault and murder, why could he not be responsible for the assault and murder of Barbara Holzman? And in the case of Mamie Walsh, she was taken from a strawberry patch to a private spot where she was assaulted and strangled to death before being passively buried close to where she was killed. Barbara was taken to that rooming house where she was assaulted, then strangled, and, at least in a manner of speaking, buried, at least under the bedding of that room. Harvey immediately, if not for a short time, became a suspect in the Holzman case. Two interesting things were noted at this point. First, Bertha Nelson abruptly changed her perspective on Leon Lockard, stating he unequivocally was not the man who checked out that room. She would also say, when shown a picture of Nathan Harvey on December 21st, that he bore an excellent likeness to the man who did check out the room. It seems to me that she just cast aside Lockard because Harvey looked more like the man. Second, it would come out that only days after the Hill murders, she was shown a picture of Harvey then. This is intriguing as it would be months before Harvey would be arrested, and yet authorities were clearly looking into him early on. But it also shows that they were wondering about him in relation to Barbara's murder. Why else would they be talking to Bertha Nelson at all, in particular in relation to Nathan Harvey? Again, the only thing keeping her from definitively identifying Harvey was the slight possibility that she was wrong. She'd be quoted to say, "I would not make a positive statement that this is the man, but the resemblance is remarkable." Pretty strong words. But even stronger than that is how flawlessly Nathan Harvey did match with the description Nelson had given months earlier, right down to the cheekbones, thinness, mustache color, and stooped shoulders that the man had. Nelson said the man was about 45 to 50 years of age, and Harvey was 51 years old at the time of the murder. He was the strongest match of any suspect that came up. But with Nelson's ID still deemed only partial, the police came up with a kind of screwball idea that didn't quite work. They knew the route Harvey took to get home, and Officer Archie Leonard accompanied Nelson to a spot along this route, waiting for Harvey to pass by. When Harvey approached, Leonard stopped them and stalled Harvey while asking how to get to Oregon City, and buying time for Nelson to both see and, more importantly, hear Harvey. When he left, Leonard asked Nelson if he was the man who checked out the room, and she said yes. However, she later pulled back on this again. While acknowledging his resemblance to the man in every way, she was just scared of sending away an innocent man. While I feel the case against Harvey in the Holzman case is substantially weaker than the Walsh and Hill murders, it still seems like Bertha Nelson felt deep down that he was the guy. With public sentiment turning against him, Nathan Harvey, a prominent local citizen in his neighborhood, was able to use his influence to be released as a suspect in the Hill case. And once he was released on that, he was abruptly forgotten as a suspect in the Holzman case. He never paid for these crimes, but Nathan Harvey may have been one of the most prominent child killers, at least in Oregon history. With time, the suspects in the case became either less and less reliable or just further examples of past futility. In March 1912, another man that Nelson would say was a close match was J.W. Ellsworth, alias J.W. Brown. He'd been released from the Oregon State Hospital shortly before Holtzman's murder, and when he was arrested, stated he had a mania for attacking young girls. He'd be arrested on March 5th in Tacoma, Washington, after trying to attack 2 little girls. He would say he was released about a week before the murder, before later saying he wasn't released until July. Nelson, surprisingly, thought she recognized him as a man who'd previously stayed at her house under the name of Jacob Hiltz. If true, this alone killed his chances of being the killer, as Nelson did not know the identity of the man who checked out the room at her place. It would finally be revealed in April that it had been definitively proven that Ellsworth was, in fact, still at the state hospital when Barbara Holtzman was killed. Another suspect, busted far from Portland, was a man, and I'm not kidding, named Bacon Clark, who was apprehended on July 5, 1912 in Klamath Falls, near the Oregon-California border. He was busted trying to lure 2 girls to his home. It was claimed that the killer was missing an index finger. A finger Clark was also missing. However, I found no verification on this claim, involving the idea that the killer of Barbara Holtzman had a missing finger, except for in the case of Bacon Clark. He also, right after his arrest, asked if he was wanted in Portland. This was all very interesting, but when their police sent a picture of Clark up to Portland, authorities were so convinced he was not Holtzman's killer that they didn't even respond back. Another unsolved crime, as they piled up during this era, occurred in Eugene, Oregon, during the early morning hours of August 19, 1912. Mildred Green, 12 years old, had been assaulted and hacked nearly to the point of decapitation. This case briefly revived the slowly dying Holtzman case, even though they likely weren't connected in any way. I, as I mentioned in a video I did on the case, personally feel that Mildred's religious zealot father killed her. But even this revival was brief. Over the next couple years, a few suspects popped up here and there, none of them very strong in my opinion. I think the police were still scrambling to try and solve it and taking whatever they could get. On September 15th, 1913, a man who apparently was never identified went on a manic run through several homes for children, carrying a rifle and attempting to lure children away. This hardly synced with the Holzman case, but was another reminder of all the child crazy creeps that were lurking all over the city. In January 1914, a man named John Little was arrested in Nebraska for assaulting a young girl. Nelson was shown a picture, and once again, a partial identification was made. He had been living in Portland at the time of Barbara's killing, working as a bricklayer in Oregon City. He was described as a 51-year-old male, 5 feet 11 and a half inches tall, short dark mustache with a few gray hairs, and stoop-shouldered. All characteristics of the man who checked in at that rooming house. Despite this, Little quickly disappeared from the headlines as a suspect. When an Olaf Johnson came under scrutiny just 2 months later, there was no mention of Little at all. Johnson was apprehended when he was overheard expressing that he had knowledge of the Holzman murder case. But as he was kept and interrogated, it was established he did not have any intriguing or previously unknown information. Probably just another guy trying to boast, or another crazy man taking credit for a crime he didn't commit. The suspects were becoming more and more absurd, and in turn, investigative tactics became more absurd. In February 1915, a man named Claude Hale came out, exposing investigators from Pinkerton and Company, no relation to the famously known Pinkerton detectives. These guys had the specialty of collecting debts, and yet a few of them shifted, apparently, to investigating murders. Hale accused these investigators of visiting his older father-in-law, a Dr. O.C. Hyatt, a man of failing faculties, getting him drunk and trying to get him to discuss the Holzman murder. Hyatt thought they were friends of his and would get so drunk he wouldn't remember what he discussed with these men. For whatever reason, these Pinkerton investigators were working with the notion that the killer had a bloody shirt, and Hyatt was found to have a bloody shirt in his possession. It would later be learned that he'd attempted suicide years earlier by shooting himself in the chest, a shooting that he obviously survived. He then kept the bloody shirt he wore afterward as a memento. When Hale brought this shabby and rather cruel harassment of his already ailing father-in-law to local press, the Pinkertons cut their nonsense. Nonsense seemed to be all that was left at this point. All previous suspects had faded away, and the only real story to happen of mild interest over the next decade occurred in October 1918 when a 4-year-old girl was killed when she was burned to death after playing with matches. She just happened to be playing with a Katie Holzman, Barbara's sister, at the time. The death happened in the basement of the Holtzmans' home. Daisy Wehrman and her 3-year-old son Harold, living in a small house in Apple Valley, just north of Portland, were both gunned down in a hail of bullets. They wouldn't be found for a couple days until a neighbor, Mrs. George Sierks, whose husband would later confess to this murder, stopped by. Shortly after the murder, a man who'd been staying in a tent near the Wehrmans' property, John Arthur Pender, would be arrested and go on multiple trials where he was tried based purely on circumstantial evidence before finally being found guilty and sentenced to hang in 1914. It appears the fact that he was staying close by and was seen in the area were all that were really used to convict him. When George Sierks, who'd been institutionalized by this time, confessed to the crime at the start of 1915, which he later repudiated, claiming he only did it to try and save Pender, it did add to the doubts that Pender was actually guilty. Another questionable suspect, William Riggin, who I discussed extensively in my video on the Hill murders, would make headlines in 1918 by claiming guilt in the Hill and Wehrman murders. By 1919, a strong push was made by those who'd known Pender as a war veteran and a man of strong moral character to have him pardoned, and finally, on September 11, 1920, he was pardoned for the Wehrman case. Many felt an innocent man had finally been freed, especially an investigator named George Thatcher, who wrote a book called Why Some Men Kill in 1919 that discussed several murders, but focused primarily on Pender and the Wehrman case. Like others, he was more than complimentary of Pender. He also felt George Sirks was likely the killer, despite numerous flaws in his account, combined with the fact that he was mentally ill, and he, Thatcher, would ultimately die shortly after writing his book due to what appears to have been a nervous breakdown. 7 years after his vindicated release, 1927, John Arthur Pender was arrested for attempting to abduct and assault a 15-year-old girl in Salem. And overnight, all of that support vanished. He became the killer of the Wehrmans again, in the public's mind, and Governor Ben Walcott, who pardoned him, expressed regret for his decision. Pender became a suspect in every other unsolved murder from that time, like the Hills and even a girl named Martha Gratke, a 15-year-old brutally murdered in her South Portland home in 1924. And, of course, he suddenly became a suspect in Barbara Holzman's murder. Bertha Nelson, listed in 1927 as Bertha Lake, was taken to a 9-man lineup, clearly to identify who looked most like Barbara's killer. She would pick Pender, and later, in classic Bertha Nelson fashion, made a partial identification. She'd be quoted to say, "Never in my life have I seen a man who looked more like the man who killed Barbara, but I cannot be sure." Mind you, this was more than 16 years after Barbara was murdered. And if you look at pictures of Pender and Nathan Harvey, both of whom Nelson said bore a remarkably similar appearance to the killer, they don't look anything alike. Case in point for the imperfections of memory. Furthermore, John Arthur Pender was only 32 years old when this murder occurred, being about 15 years younger than the killer as Nelson described him. He had a full face and was clean-shaven most of the time. It bewilders me how this man could be a positive match for the individual Bertha Nelson described back in 1911. Like Nathan Harvey, Pender is another one of those people who maybe, at the very least, attacked one or two people, and at the worst, may have been a crazed serial killer. But I don't think he killed Barbara Holzman, and I think the fact he was even seriously considered as a suspect was due to the mania that followed his 1927 arrest. And even by December of 1927, when Pender was convicted for this attack on the Salem girl, he was no longer even being discussed in terms of these other cases. After this, the Barbara Holzman case vanished from print. No more new suspects, no new revelations. And granted, by this point the murder was over 16 years old. The case faded into obscurity as, what often happens with time, stories fade from memory. Despite Barbara's murder happening more than 112 years ago, her last surviving sibling, who granted was born many years after her, didn't pass away until 2017. Now, I did not come into this story to make it a complete trilogy on the likely murders of a man named Nathan Harvey. While I still feel like the cases against him for the murders of Mamie Walsh in 1892 and the Hill family in 1911 are stronger than the case against him for Barbara Holzman, I cannot ignore the strong elements against him. It's also an issue that most of the others looked into for Barbara's murder were low-end criminals, creeps, and transients. I wasn't able to find pictures of most of them, which doesn't surprise me. This forces us to only address Bertha Nelson's statements about them, as she claimed a few of them looked exactly like the man she saw check out the room. But in Nathan Harvey, we have a man with a sketchy past who was actually photographed. And because he was held briefly for the Hill murders in late 1911, we have a picture of him from the very year that Barbara was killed, meaning we know what he looked like around the time of this murder. Let us again recall the detailed description given by Bertha Nelson on the man who checked out the room in relation to how Nathan Harvey looked at that time. The man was 45 to 50 years old, possibly a little older. Harvey was 51 years old at the time. The man was 6 feet tall and a thin 160 pounds. Harvey was also 6 feet tall and of a thin build. The man was stoop-shouldered, and while we don't know for certain if Harvey was specifically stoop-shouldered, in the 1911 picture of him, his shoulders do appear to be angling downward. He had a short, dark mustache sprinkled with gray hairs and was otherwise clean-shaven. This matches Harvey's 1911 picture to a T. The man also had sunken cheekbones, which also matched Harvey perfectly. Always a thin man, clearly as he'd grown older, Harvey had become even thinner, allowing for a bony face and a weight only normal for a 6-foot-tall man of small frame. Beyond these appearance commonalities, Bertha also said the man wore a nice coat but looked like a laborer. Nathan Harvey was a well-to-do man who could afford things like, say, a nice coat, but as a long-term farmer, he also had a rough, weathered, labored look about him. His correlation with the man who killed Barbara Holzman is uncanny, and for a while, Nelson stated that he was the man who checked out the room. She only pulled back when that fear crept in that she could have been mistaken, and the lingering guilt of sending an innocent man to the gas chamber. It is also worth noting that shortly after the Hill murders, around the time in which Nelson was being shown pictures of Harvey, implying authorities were looking at him in the Holzman case as far back as June 1911, Harvey immediately started trying to lawyer up. This was months before law enforcement even seriously targeted him as a suspect in the Hill case, with suspicions about Barbara's murder soon to follow. It's one thing to lawyer up in the moment the heat's put on you, but to do it months before anyone says anything about you is a whole other level of suspicion. Harvey would claim the police were harassing him at this time, but we only have his word on that matter, and that only came out months later when he was already becoming the primary suspect in the Hill murders. It indicates, at the very least, that Harvey knew there was reason for people to suspect he was a criminal of the worst type. All this said, Nathan Harvey was hardly the only thin, worn-down-looking middle-aged man walking around Portland at the time. They were everywhere. And the murder of Barbara Holzman helped reveal a plethora of demented creeps around town, potentially capable of doing to a child what had happened to little Barbara. I have found nothing to suggest that Harvey frequented the area where Barbara lived, or that he had a possible connection to her family. This makes it hard to believe that he had known of her and awaited an opportunity to take her. That said, he was a businessman known to travel all over the Portland area, meaning he could have been in Holtzman's neighborhood in the past. But still, This all suggests that if Nathan Harvey was the guilty party, he must have been in the right place at the right time, seeing a little girl walking by herself and seizing the opportunity. On a side note, one of the other suspects I was able to find a picture for was J.W. Ellsworth, who came under suspicion and was quickly dismissed when it was deemed he was institutionalized when the murder occurred. But if we, for a moment, consider that this could have been an error, and that he was free when Barbara was killed, I feel he also shares some similarities to Bertha Nelson's description, but not as many as Nathan Harvey. He appeared to be the right age, but he was clean-shaven, not to say he couldn't have had a mustache at one point, and he's fairly full of face, no sunken cheekbones, so either way, it probably wasn't him. While Harvey certainly had the appearance in the past to be this killer, there's so much we don't know that makes it hard to definitively put a finger on him for the crime. I think it's more likely that some middle-aged creeper who lived in or frequented the area Barbara lived in was her abductor. It could have even been someone right on her street, or at least close enough that he'd kept a periodic eye on her. God forbid, he may have even been a friend of the family, with an insight into how they lived. He saw her leave home or encountered her on the way to the meat market and lured her away. While stranger danger was not really a thing back in 1911, it still seems likely that Barbara wouldn't have willingly gone with a complete stranger. Especially since it was her birthday and she was on an errand and expected back home shortly. But if she knew her killer, she might be more inclined to go with them. She also would probably act normal around someone she knew, capturing no attention as the two walked to the rooming house where her life would end. And that's something that's really stuck with me. The seeming luck the abductor had as he, so it seems, snuck this girl into that rooming house in broad daylight without so much as one witness. And this wasn't some obscure home in the sticks. This was a house along Albina's main drag with pedestrians all over and businesses on the ground floor of that building. Numerous people that could have, and some of which probably did, see Barbara enter that house, but paid it little mind, not enough to remember. Still in all, it's crazy to think this man just brought this girl right in there, in the middle of the day, seemingly unafraid of being seen with this girl, who would later be found dead. This also wasn't a very large rooming house, and how would Bertha Nelson have not seen her? Again, by her account, the man checked in during the morning hours of March 13th before leaving for about 2.5 hours, returning around 1 p.m. It's not fully clear as to whether Nelson actually saw the man when he returned, or just attributed his return to a sound that she heard in his room around that time. If she hadn't seen him, it stands to reason that he returned with Barbara in tow, probably incapacitated. The killer may have just been fearless. He may have been desperate. He may have just been stupid. These numerous men captured and briefly considered as suspects in her case around the time of her death were not exactly intelligent or stealthy as they harassed local girls. Perhaps they just didn't have the luck that Barbara's killer did. Another detail that continues to elude us is where exactly this meat market was. It's easy to assume it was very close to the Holzman's house, as it's hard to think from 2023 that a small child would be sent on a distant errand. But the Holzmans lived only about 10 blocks from the main drag along Russell Street. With this being a main drag area and close by, it's not beyond reason to think the meat market was in this area. Therefore, even if Barbara made it to the market, of which there's no evidence she did, and this man met her near there, managing to get her to that rooming house could have been as simple as traveling just a block or two. While there's reasons to believe Barbara was taken by a stranger, The possibility that the killer may have been someone familiar to the family led me to try, albeit on a whim, to see if I could find any stories along the lines of attempted abductions or attacks on any of her siblings. I wasn't expecting to find anything, and didn't. I do feel a dark horse suspect could be John Little, who popped up as a potential suspect in 1914 and then quickly disappeared from headlines, for whatever reason. He was listed as being 51 years old in 1914, suggesting he was about 48 when the murders occurred. Again, the killer was about 6 feet tall. Little was 5 feet 11 and a half inches tall. The killer weighed about 160 pounds, and Little was listed as being 170. He had brown hair with a mix of gray, including a brown mustache with grays in it. He was also stoop-shouldered. I only wish I could have found a picture of him, not for a lack of trying. He also was in the Portland area when the murder happened, working again as a bricklayer, among other labor jobs, meaning he most likely had a labor-type appearance. And he was apprehended in September 1913 for attempting to assault an 8-year-old girl, almost leading to a lynching. According to info from authorities, John Little also told him that he knew details about the Holzman murder, and he had a previous record of deviant behavior, established well before 1911. The last article I found on Little, before he vanished from print, were claims by Portland investigators that they felt, at last, that they had found Barbara Holtzman's killer. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. And on a slight side note, even Bertha Nelson's information in this story is interesting. I stumbled onto a woman who died in 1951 named Bertha Nelson and was buried in Portland. She was born in 1867 in Norway as Bertha Moen. Strangely enough, around this time in Norway, Bertha Nelson was also born, Bertha Moen. They both were born to a father named Knut Moen. It stands to reason, as Ancestry.com is hardly perfect, that these were the same people with a few inaccuracies in their information. This was a relief to me, as Bertha Nelsen's profile on Ancestry included several pictures, leading me to believe I had found some photographs of a prominent person in this story. But despite all of this, these two could not have been the same person, because Bertha Nelsen has a death certificate listing her death as occurring on March 11, 1951, due to a long struggle with cardiovascular disease. Bertha Nelson, who later married a Charles Lake, also had a death certificate listing her death, and that was on August 7, 1939, due to a cerebral hemorrhage. So unless Bertha Nelson, or Lake, was accidentally deemed dead to the point that an invalid death certificate was made for her, and she actually died 12 years later, then we just happen to have two women, born close to the same time, in the same country, with the same first and last names at birth, and with a father who had the same first and last name. Now, I spent time in this piece calling Bertha Nelson's memory into question while being at least mildly critical that police were so quick to dismiss suspects based solely on her observations. But this is not to be critical of her as a person, obviously. An imperfect memory affects all of us. I respect Bertha greatly and believe she was genuinely traumatized by what she had seen. Who wouldn't be? She clearly tried her best to help, willingly offering her services every time the next guy came along as a suspect. And while her memory could never be perfect, the initial description she gave of the man is the most reliable aspect of what she had to offer. And my intrigue as far as suspects like Nathan Harvey and even John Little is almost exclusively the product of their close matches to that description, not what she may have had to say about them later. And I think her propensity to partially identify some men whom she later definitively said were not the man that she saw was due to the fact that she was likely overwhelmed by everything that was happening. Again, who wouldn't be? Here was a middle-aged immigrant who just wanted to run her little rooming house before suddenly being thrust forward as the only witness in what could have been the murder mystery of the decade, had the Hills not been murdered only weeks later. Repeatedly for weeks and stretching on for years, she would be thrust back into the spotlight whenever the next suspect came along. And at times, I feel she really just wanted it to be over, and these later, taken back identifications resulted from that. If she just said this guy was the guy, maybe it would all be over and go away and she'd finally be left alone. I think any of us can identify with that. But that's also the problem. Considering her fears of being wrong, I honestly don't think Bertha was ever going to identify any suspect to a 100% certainty. There'd always be room for at least a hint of doubt. And in that regard, this case was really destined to forever be a mystery the moment that the crime happened. Nelson was never going to fully identify anyone, and the legal system was going to rely exclusively on her identification to lead to an arrest and presumably prosecution of any given individual. And considering the climate of the time, the depravity of the crime, the fact that she was the only witness, and the fact that every man looked into for this crime had a past of at least pursuing children, I also have little doubt that had Bertha Nelson identified one of these men, beyond a reasonable doubt, at least in her words, and they'd gone to trial for that murder, they most certainly would have been convicted by a jury and executed in short order. Justice would have been swift, and in the aftermath, the world would have accepted this conclusion and moved on. Aside from Bertha Nelson, I think even after all of that, she would have had that doubt lingering in her mind, likely haunting her. The fact of the matter is, in the moment, she never reached absolute certainty on any of these men, and thus, frustrating though it is, did the right thing. She did the best she could under circumstances she never asked to be in, and of which I feel many of us would not have handled nearly as well. She tried. It's always hard in a case, especially like this one, to consider the possibility that we'll never come close to knowing who the actual killer was. You do the best with what you have and the suspects available. But in the end, if there's nothing definitive, the case lingers as unsolved. But it's a very real possibility, even though I do believe Nathan Harvey to be the strongest suspect we know of, that the killer was someone who was never suspected. He could have been a local with an, on the surface, squeaky clean reputation that surely no one would consider guilty of such a crime. We also have to recall the attitudes of this time. Not that this has fully gone away now, but it was rampant back in the day that if you had the right look, you were guilty. And if you looked innocent, you were. Anyone with a quarter of a brain knows that this is absurd, but such an attitude has allowed people of appeal or influence or even just the right look to get away with horrible crimes of all sorts. We must recall the primary thing that got Nathan Harvey dismissed in relation to the Hill and Holzman cases was his influence. It equally could have been a local laborer or transient that nobody considered, or even, as Portland was known as a transient city with lots of workers coming and going, someone who was in the town briefly and split Portland entirely after killing Barbara. He's someone who could have been here such a short time that nobody even knew he was here. Many rooming houses, Bertha Nelson's included, did not require tenants to provide their names, and even if they did, it would have been easy to just give a fake name. You didn't have to have an ID or a credit card, just enough cash in your pocket. I still waver on the type of person who I think was most likely responsible. If it was one of the men suspected in the crime or just a mystery man, we'll never know. Either way, with a case cold for over a century, I have little doubt that the murder of Barbara Holzman is going to remain unsolved. Unless, somehow, there's some written confession collecting dust somewhere. And even then, could that confession even be validated? Or perhaps the guilty party is known through their family lineage, and they have surviving family members who have heard the story of that relative who committed this atrocity. But again, unlikely though that is, how would we even verify that? There's no lingering evidence, no DNA. The crime scene is long gone. There's only one witness who could never reach a 100% yes on any man for fear of being wrong. What do we have left here? We have nothing. But we do still have a true story. A little girl murdered on her birthday who has never received justice. And if that justice will forever elude her, the least we can do is keep her story alive.